Thank you for the warmest of welcomes. It's really nice to be here with you all this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are. So, Nancy, as you said, I'm Angie Browne. I'm a former education leader. I actually like to tell people I'm an English teacher. Truly, I'm an English teacher, and I became an education leader. And I worked in the southwest of England for my entire career. And I worked with children and families who were described often as failing to thrive in the mainstream school system. And I began to find some specialism with supporting children in settings other than mainstream schools, despite my training as a mainstream secondary English teacher. And what I realized when I look back over my 24 years in those schools, in urban schools in the southwest of England, is that I have always been really touched, moved, motivated by the opportunity to work with young people and families who came from historically excluded or marginalized backgrounds, historically marginalized groups of people. And I really love working with their families. I like working with human beings of all kinds, but I really love working with those young people's families. And because many of those children and families were marginalized, it was often the case that I was working in liminal spaces. And I really recognize that when I look back over my career. I think about how many times I was working with people who were living some kind of liminal existence, one that wasn't always understood, somehow kind of outside of the mainstream, not quite in the mainstream. Often children who were having their education kind of out of school, not in real school, if you were like, in alternative provisions. And then how many opportunities I sought as a leader applying for new jobs to lead in schools in liminality. So I led a state-funded Steiner school. They don't really exist, only I managed to find one. I led in alternative provision when it wasn't really the thing to do. It was the moment when people said, oh, your career might be ruined as a consequence of stepping out of the mainstream. So liminality, being slightly out of the mainstream, has always really, really interested me. And I think it's a really interesting place to be, because I think in liminality we can grow really fantastic and interesting things. And so that's what I want to explore with you a bit over the course of the next 50 or so minutes. So what am I even talking about? Well, Nancy Levin would describe liminality as being the space between no longer and not yet. And I find that so exciting. It's like a liberatory place within which so much possibility is made possible. And again, going back to my work as a school leader, but also thinking about the school leaders that I work with now as a coach and as a consultant, there is something for me about the relationship between education leadership, and liminality. I think those things are actually quite tightly bound. And so I'd like to explore that a bit with you, the extent to which you understand your roles as educationalists, as education leaders, as also being about honoring the space between no longer and not yet. And with that in mind, I would also like to set a bit of a container around this session, just to say that I would like us to use this 50 minutes to create a liminal space of a kind, a space where we recognize that maybe the way that we're coming in is going to be different to the way that we leave. And I would like to see what creative possibilities we can come up with over the course. Now, I want to share something more with you, and there are going to be a few moments of me reading to you in this session, because, as I say, anything is possible in the liminal space, and I'm an English teacher. So I'm going to invite you to have a look at these words from Christine McDougall. She wrote this brief poem, Liminal. The space between neither this nor that, ripe, potent, uncertain, shaky, a dawning, a dusking, the imminent threshold emerging, crossing to what? Slow down. The moment is calling you to pay exquisite attention. And every time I read it, I take a breath, because what liminal spaces invite us to do is to slow down and pay attention to exactly what is happening right now. Having left what has gone before and not quite yet entered what is coming next. And as we just slow down to think about what's happening right now, I'm going to invite you into a few questions, and just to consider for a moment. We've just returned from a summer break. And I guess my first question is, what did that summer break, that pause, allow you to pay exquisite attention to? Maybe just make a note of that for yourself right now. What pause did you take? What were you able to pay exquisite attention to during this most recent break of yours? And in many cases, exquisite attention might have been to the unfurling of some flowers, or the growth of your tomatoes or your cucumbers, or whatever was going on in your gardens. But it could also have been the news. If you were based in Europe, I'm no longer living in the UK, I live in Denmark, but the summer allowed me to pay sometimes painful but exquisite attention to the unfolding of the riots in the UK, centered as they were around race and as they were around Islamophobia. And that pause, that break in my working life allowed me once again to return to topics that have really confounded me. They confound me in my work, but I was able to slow down and pay attention. The summer break also allowed me to, sometimes unwillingly, sometimes painfully, pay more attention, sometimes exquisite attention, to the pain and the suffering of people in Palestine. Sometimes that pause allowed me to deepen my engagement with the world. The pause in the summer break for us as educationalists and school leaders often allows us to pay exquisite attention to our friends and to our families, and to begin to think again about community and the communities that we're building in our schools. I wonder if any of you were able to go back in and think about, when I return in September, when I return in August, I'd like us to rethink about our school community, the way our school organizes itself around its community, the way our communities organize themselves around our school. And so I have some shorter questions for you, but questions I would now like you to actually write an answer to. And they are questions that return to Christine McDougall's point here about a dawning, a dusking that can take place in this liminal space. I'd like you to think about your return into school in this new term, that moment of the threshold. I often think the night before the first day of school, when we feel a little bit unsure about what's coming, but there might have been a dusking, something that we set our sun set on. And I'd like you to just answer these couple of questions. So with that threshold in mind, that return to school in mind, I'd like you to think about what is dusking. What is dusking for you personally in this liminal moment of the return back into school? And also, what is dusking for your organization? What is the sun setting on for you personally, and what is it setting on in your organization? And I'd like you to write one sentence answers for both of those, please. So a personal dusking, my career as a school head, retiring at the end of the year. So in a sense, DJ, is that, do I call you DJ? Okay. There's this entire year that begins to unfurl as a liminal moment, which is really interesting. That liminality is also something that can happen on the threshold between, the day of my summer holidays and the day that school starts. And in between these moments of, I have been employed as a school leader and next year I won't be. So we have this entire year of liminality. And those personal duskings are things that I feel like we need to bring exquisite attention to. They are moments in which we can really determine everything that happens next. And they are really exciting for that very reason. My work at my current school is dusking. A few of you are dusking your work in your current position, then leaving at the end of the year, both personal and professional. Really, really exciting. And personal duskings, reflections on future and values on ethos. And I think that's so helpful, Claire. As we recognize ways we've shown up in the past, we also have the opportunity to say, and in the future, it will be different. And so I personally dusk this way of showing up. I personally dusk this articulation of my values, of my ethos. My role as providing parent as our second child graduates. So exciting. Those thresholds that our children go through also become things that we dusk. They become liminal spaces for us too, as we graduate from being a parent of a particular kind to a parent in another realm altogether. Wonderful. I love these. Really, really beautiful. And so, of course, the kind of relationship to that question is, what is dawning? What is dawning for you personally in this liminal moment? What is dawning for your organization? And so, is there an opportunity to think all sort of maybe not as tangibly, and maybe it doesn't come in one sentence? Is there a shape that emerges in the dawn of something coming? And I really like it if you can write a sentence, and that's great. But I also am really interested in the impressions that might be forming in the dawning. And it's helpful because it's connected to another idea that I want to introduce you to, if those dawnings are not quite as concrete. So you can think about what's dawning for you personally in this liminal moment. It could be something that's dawning for you right now in the liminal moment of this 50-minute session, or something that's over the course of the next few days, weeks, months, or even years is beginning to dawn. And I'm really interested in your organizations as well. What's dawning for your schools and your school communities? Grandparenthood. Wonderful. DJ, what an incredible chapter you're entering into, or you're in right now. How fantastic. And the organizational dawning of student self-directed learning, competency-based learning. What an exciting opportunity for those young people too. Any other personal or professional dawnings? Wow. An unknown as yet new era for the organization, Claire. Fantastic. Integrated language environment for all students. Beautiful. I love these organizational dawnings, and I think that the way in which we can capture the spaces in between allow for the excitement of what's to come. As we communicate that we're in a space in between, we're able to communicate also, we kind of have a sense that we're going over here, and we allow people to also start to share their vision and find their place in what might be dawning, what might be coming next. I love these. Thank you so much for sharing. And we can continue to add things into the chat if it feels like it's relevant. But I want to I kind of share that idea in that poem with you, because this idea of dusking and dawning are really critical to the way that I work. And they've been critical to the way that I work and the way that I think for a long time. As I say, I have deliberately positioned myself in liminal roles, partly to begin to feel the dusking and the dawning, to feel the what has gone before and what might become, and to feel the tension of those two things. And I've also been greatly influenced by others. Now, the dusk and the dawn obviously sit either side of this liminal space. And I want to share a perspective on that that I really took as inspiration for my book, Lighting the Way, that Nancy kindly shared with everybody. And I want to let you know that actually the inspiration for both the title of my book, Lighting the Way, and many of the other things that have come since then were from a book by another Nancy, and Nancy Duarte. So Nancy Duarte wrote this book, Illuminate. And it's a kind of marketing book, I guess. And in many ways, Nancy Duarte is a communication expert. And she wrote this book, Illuminate, Ignite Change Through Speeches, Stories, Ceremonies, and Symbols. And in her book, at the beginning of the book, she talks about leadership, and she talks about this idea that leaders patrol the border between now and next. So again, leaders are squarely positioned by Nancy Duarte in the liminal space, patrolling the border between now and next. And what they do is they light the way to a better reality or an alternative reality. Often what she says in her book is that leaders are saying, I'm lighting the way towards something. I think it's the right way to go. I'm not sure. Would you like to come with me? And so we're kind of, we're what she describes as torchbearers. And she goes further. She writes a short poem again called the Torchbearer's Calling. In it, she writes, the future is a formless void, a blank space waiting to be filled. And then a torchbearer envisions a new possibility. That vision is your dream, your calling, and it burns like a fire in your belly. But you can't create the future alone. You need travelers to come along. Yet the path through the unknown is dark and unclear. You have to illuminate the path for your travelers. Torchbearers communicate in a way that conquers fear and inspires hope. Some say being a torchbearer is a burden. Some say it's a blessing. Either way, those who light the path are the ones who change the world. And it really influenced me. It influenced the title of my book. It influenced the name of my company, being Luminary. The idea of lighting the way for myself and for others has become such a compelling idea for me that I have used it in almost all aspects of my work. And where I find it particularly useful is in my work in contexts in which young people and their families are experiencing significant challenge, where they are marginalized, discriminated against, experiencing financial anxiety or worrying, experiencing worry around their health or other aspects of their survival. And this idea of lighting the way towards something better is absolutely instrumental in my work as a diversity, equity, inclusion consultant, of course, because everything I do is about saying, I recognize what has been. I also appreciate that we're in this moment where we don't quite know what is coming, but I do see a better reality. I do see an opportunity. This is a future that I think could be workable. I am shining a light on it. Will you come with me? And so I'd like you to think about yourselves as not both in this liminal space, but also about people who are potentially torchbearers, who are lighting a way towards something, not just seeing that a sun is rising, but also holding the very light that represents the future. Now, I promised Nancy that I would share, I guess, some of my rationale through the lens of diversity, equity, inclusion. And so bear with me, because this next portion of what I wanted to share with you feels a bit bleak. And I'm an incredibly optimistic person who is often feeling really very, very positive about the future. And I guess one of the advantages of feeling all the time that I am a torchbearer and that I do have light to shine means that I'm able to deal with the very bleakness of both the clients that I work with, the people that I serve, and the reality of my work in the world. And this for me is often the tension of being a school leader. How do I hold everything that is very painful and very difficult, and also have courage and faith that things are going to change? This is the tension of diversity, equity, inclusion work. And the constant dilemma is how to present that bleakness, but at the same time, inspire courage that we can do something about it. Now, recognizing that a lot of this work and this change will happen in the liminal space is very, very helpful. So recognizing that I can take you to a bleak place, hold you in a liminal space, and propel you towards something really positive is my conviction. And I'm very confident about that. So go with me, if you will, into the backdrop for some of my work. Now, as a diversity, equity, inclusion consultant, I consider my work to be to represent, to show allyship for, to educate people around many of the contexts that exist for people who hold minoritized identities, marginalized identities. And so my work is rooted in the Equality Act. I'm from the UK, and so my work is rooted in the Equality Act of 2010. And I'm very focused on the 9 protected characteristics, those characteristics of identity that are protected by that Equality Act. So as a diversity, equity, inclusion consultant, I look at sex, pregnancy and maternity, I look at race, I look at sexual orientation, I look at gender, I look at disability, I look at religion and belief, and that's squarely where I position my work. But for now, let's just take one of those characteristics of identity, and let me show you what it means for me to be in a liminal space, reflecting both on the past and also on the future. For me, it means recognizing a backdrop that is dark and that is difficult and that I have to lead out of. So when I think about race, I identify a backdrop in which Black and brown children, because I am focused on children, are often disproportionately affected by, for example, fuel poverty. Many of our Black and brown children in the UK and in Europe, in the States, many Black and brown children who are growing up in Middle East, who are growing up in Southeast Asia, are going to be disproportionately affected by, for example, fuel poverty. I mean, this is really interesting to me. We'll live in households where less than 8% of the income of the household can be spent on fuel to maintain an adequate level of warmth. In the UK, a recent study found that 37% of Black households are fuel poor, compared to only around 15% of white British households. And so my backdrop, my work, is really coloured by some of those stark racial disparities. And I have to find a way of lighting the way towards something different. I have to sit within this liminal space, recognizing that there is something that I want very much to dusk, and that is those stark disparities, and something that I very much want to dawn. And that is that sense of equity that all young people will experience, an equity. I have to recognize, though, that there is an intersection in the country in which I live, and for many of the clients that I serve, between race, housing quality, energy, inefficiency, that would disproportionately impact many of the people that I serve and that I work with. My backdrop includes things like recognizing that Black and brown children, those very children that I serve and that I work with, are more likely to be stopped and searched compared to their white counterparts in several countries, particularly those in the US and the UK. I have a brown child. My brown child is 7 times more likely to be stopped and searched than his white peers. Last year, he was 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched than his white peers. Those statistics just get worse and worse and worse. And it's worse still in the United States. But if I'm to light the way towards something different, I have to find a way of reconciling the past that I want to dawn. I have to find a way of introducing that past into my kind of liminal space. I have to find a way of playing with it and toying with it and thinking differently so that I can light the way towards something else. And so part of being in liminality, what I'm trying to say, I guess, is that we have to bring the kind of ugly truths. We have to bring all of that sort of Maya, I guess, into the mix in order that we can say, and this is how it's going to be different. The backdrop in my work includes things like recognizing that a child who looks just like my one is going to be disproportionately affected by mental health legislation. Children who are Black and brown, particularly those from African and Caribbean backgrounds in the UK, are disproportionately likely to be sectioned, detained for compulsory treatment under the Mental Health Act. And they are 4 times more likely than their white peers last year to be detained, restrained, or given forced treatment. They're also going to be less likely to be able to access preventative mental health services. They're also the children who are less likely to be recognized as having anything wrong with them. So they are more likely to be misdiagnosed, and they are likely to receive very, very delayed mental health treatment. So there are all sorts of things going on for the young people that I work with and their families, and there are all sorts of recognitions that I need to have in the liminal space. And some of those recognitions need to also be, how have I contributed towards the experience of these Black and brown children? I also have run institutions. I've been a head teacher across 3 different settings, and my institution is not immune. So as I gather up that backdrop, I then say to myself, and how has education contributed to the mistreatment of Black and brown children? And what has my part been? Because in order to light the way towards something different, I have to absolutely squarely look at my own practice. And I do that in that liminal space in which there is no blame and no shame and no guilt. There is no judgment. There is just the opportunity to reframe everything that comes next. There is just that recognition that I'm on the threshold. I have the opportunity to do something differently. And so that's what I do. I say, what will I light the way towards next? And what do I need in order to get there? And that's what I'm going to give you the opportunity to do right now. Just to think about the liminal moment that you are in, and to think if there's anything that you could bring into this liminal moment to make it ultimately enriching and to make what you are lighting the way towards absolutely resonant, not just for you, but for everybody that you are leading either in your family or in your workplace. Because often what I think we do is we try to exclude things from the moment and from the threshold because it's convenient and because it feels good. But there are things that we can richly bring into the moment in order to really make the next step resonant. So I'm just going to give you a moment to try and do that. And then we're going to do a task together, which I hope makes this exercise feel a little lighter. But just take a moment to see if there's anything that you've left out, anything that you could bring into this moment. And don't feel like you need to share this in the chat. Just take a moment to see if there's anything you could bring into this moment to make what you want to light the way towards ultimately incredibly resonant. Okay. I'm going to give you the opportunity to come back to that. as we go through the next exercise. So you can, if you didn't manage to note anything down, then that's completely fine. You can also come back to that reflection. Now, I've been through, so many of these moments. I go through them all the time in my work. And I've really had to recognize that I guess one of the most transformational moments in my work has been when I recognized that I'm not teaching anyone anything. I'm not kind of saying, oh, I know how to be anti-racist, and I'm going to teach you all the things that you need to know in order to be anti-racist. I'm kind of showing everyone all the ways that I have been racist in order that they can say, oh, I recognize all the ways that I'm also racist too. Does that make sense? So often this sort of liminal space has been more about me coming to terms with myself than anything else. And so that the example I gave you of being somebody that has to kind of dredge the depths of all of these terrible things that happen in the world in order to shine a light on the future also means dredging the depths of all of the things that I have done, and hopefully doing better in the future. But this comes at a cost. It comes at a personal cost. There was a moment when I realized that the hardest critic I had been the hardest critic of one of the members of my school community. And she was a member of my school community who looked most like me. So at the time, I was a head teacher of a secondary school of around 1,200 children in the southwest of England, a rural, thriving secondary school. And I was one of very few Black people in the school, and I happened to be the head teacher of the school as well. And we had a child in the school who was one of those Black or brown children that I'm talking about, who was really failing to thrive, and he kept being excluded. And I was his mother's harshest critic. I kept coming back to how ultimately, if she wouldn't come into a meeting about him, then we couldn't really, move things forward. I was so harsh on her. And, the reasons she wasn't coming into a meeting were for many of the reasons that I have highlighted on the slides before, but also because she was a single parent, as was I. She was the working mother, as was I. She was the parent to a Black boy in the UK, as was I. I knew all of the challenges of her situation, and I was her harshest critic. And so I've really had to plumb the depths of some of what I have done in order to do my best work. And I do that in this space, and I do it with great compassion. And that's what I want to offer as the kind of the antidote, I guess, to working in this betwixt and between space, because it's hard work. And so as I do a bit of an about turn, I want to introduce compassion into the mix, vital for all people around us, but vital for ourselves too. So compassion for others, I think we all recognize as leaders, it's critical. We need to have compassion for others if we're going to be ethical leaders, I think, and if we're going to manage the very backdrop that I've just presented to you. We're in liminal times anyway, politically, geopolitically. This feels like a very liminal time. We are definitely betwixt and between. If you believe in astrology or you follow astrology, we're in liminal times. And I think that compassion for others is really, really critical. I'm always wondering why school leaders are not taught to kind of demonstrate compassion. I'm always wondering why school leaders are not taught the importance of being able to tolerate the distress of other people. I write in the book, a senior leader who shuts down when people break down in tears or feels discomfort when somebody hits hard times, when somebody's managing a death in the family or somebody's managing, a crisis of another kind. A school leader who can't respond appropriately causes immeasurable damage, I believe, to the sufferer. And so for me, a tolerance for distress is really, really critical. And we need to make space as school leaders for compassion, for distress tolerance, for people to be able to manifest all emotions properly in the workplace. Those things bind us together. Those things remind us of our collective humanity. And compassion for others, for me, is a sort of compassion directed outwards, is often found in the ability to direct compassion inwards. So in answer to that question, can compassion be taught? I think to the extent that we can be compassionate to ourselves, we can teach ourselves to be compassionate to other people. And so compassion directed inward then becomes the even more critical skill, if you like, to learn as a leader. Something that allows us to really be authentic, to really kind of be able to stand in our truest self, is the sort of fashionable way of talking about it, I guess. But compassion directed inward gets us so far. It allows us to thrive in the muck and the mire. It allows us to withstand with great resilience all those liminal spaces in which we're just not sure of everything. We're not sure of anything, rather. We're not sure of what's the sun is setting on, and we're not sure of what's coming next. So one of the great researchers on compassion was a woman called Kristin Neff. She did her PhD on compassion, measuring compassion, showing us how to build compassion. And her research has gone into various other research papers on the efficacy of practicing self-compassion. What she found is that greater levels of self-compassion have been shown to correlate with increased happiness and self-confidence and motivation to improve physical health, satisfaction in life generally. And that the flip side of that is that where we don't have compassion, we increase our levels of anxiety and stress and depression and shame. And shame is the thing that we find when we do things like plumb the depths and realize that we have been a critic of somebody in our very school community and find ourselves unworthy. So self-compassion is really important to mitigating shame. Shame, I think, gets in the way of our best work. And what Kristin Neff said is that self-compassion has three important aspects: mindfulness, self-kindness, and common humanity. So mindfulness, being able to show a clear and non-judgmental awareness of our experiences in the present moment. This is the first step she shows us towards developing self-compassion. First thing that we need to be able to do is to see clearly and recognize that we are suffering or that we are in pain. I recognize that I am feeling absolute shame about critiquing this mother who is so much like me, looks so much like me. Mindfulness is kind of bringing clear, non-judgmental awareness to that. Self-kindness then offsets our inclination to beat ourselves up when we have gotten things wrong. So we are well versed in self-criticism. We are very good at being critiques of ourselves. Any of you who are the 3 a.m. types who wake up thinking about all the things that we've gotten wrong will be aware of those stress chemicals flooding through the body as we critique everything that we've done. And as we do that, we deny ourselves of well-being, clear seeing, and creativity that is made possible when we are kind. And the third strand she talks about when it comes to compassion directed in is recognizing our interconnectedness, recognizing that we're just human. We're born, therefore we're worthy. We are all imperfect. We will all have troubles and we will all suffer at some time. And she helps us in her paper by answering this question: is self-compassion self-indulgence? She says, no, it absolutely isn't. It's not a form of self-pity. It does not mean any kind of weakness. It will not make us complacent. It is not narcissistic. It is not selfish. This is simply something that we can offer everybody and ourselves. And so, to that end, let's do some self-compassion. Let's practice some self-compassion. I have this self-compassion DIY for you. So I would like you to think of a recent situation, one that is challenging, potentially could be one that is disturbing. I'd like you to pick something that's not a major disaster, but not a tiny molehill. I would like you to just note down how this situation is currently making you feel. And if you can write down your feelings, teachers are often very good at writing down what they think, not what they feel. So if you could write down your feelings and notice if there is anything going on in your body, so any somatic expression of that feeling could also be reflected on in your notes too. Okay, I didn't give you long. Step 2, I'm going to ask you to just do a tiny paragraph of a note. So you can see that this can be expanded upon. I'd like you to write a note as if you were comforting a loved one or a dear friend who was facing the same difficult situation that you identified in step 1. Write down what's in your heart and mind that you would think would bring comfort, consolation, or insight to this person. And I would like you to start it, dear, and then your name. With what you've written so far, and with yourself still on mute, I would like you to read your note aloud to yourself. So you preface your note, dear Angie, and then you just read what you've written. But I just want to add one more thing. I would like you to read this note aloud with loving kindness. And I mean loving kindness. And I would like you to let what you have written really soak in. So not, oh yeah, Angie's asked us to read this thing online to each other, to ourselves a lot. I want you to now take this seriously. I want you to read it with loving kindness. Say your name, read your note, and try to let that sink in. Now, Nancy, we don't have very much time, but I would really like for people to spend just 3 or 4 minutes in a breakout room just talking about the experience of reading that aloud, bringing some compassion into the mix. Could we just have a few breakout rooms just for a few moments? That would be great. Some really good smiles coming out of that that breakout room. I'm really pleased to see that. Sometimes there's tears coming out of that breakout room, which I'm also pleased to see as well. If there's anything, then we've plumbed the depths, and that's always great. So I hope you can see how there's a necessity for compassion when we're talking about the sort of heaviness, I guess, of what liminality really looks like. And it's not that, I mean, it's exciting, and it's often a place of great fruitfulness, I think. But there is something about it that requires us to really go deep. And for that, we need compassion. But I also think, aside from where, the kind of concept of leading out of liminality, that self-compassion exercise is pretty vital for our leadership. And I hope that you can see the opportunity for that, and where that could go with you as leaders, but also with your people. I just want to share one final reflection with you before we close, and I offer you the chance to ask any questions if you have any. And this is Richard Ward, who just writes brilliantly again on liminality. He writes, liminality is an inner state and sometimes an outer situation where people can begin to think and act in genuinely new ways. It is when we are betwixt and between, have left one room but not yet entered the next room. Any hiatus between stages of life, stages of faith, jobs, loves, or relationships. It is that graced time when we are not certain or in control, when something genuinely new can happen. Thank you very much for joining me in that space today. I really hope that you feel a little more nourished than when you arrived. I'm going to share my contact details with you. I love to be in touch with people. And also say, in this last minute, does anyone have any questions they want to ask or anything they would like to share?